In the vast darkness between stars, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a universal truth that every species learns too late. Never underestimate the bonds that tie a parent to their child. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 17 star systems, enslaved dozens of species, and built their reputation on calculated cruelty. They had faced the warriors of Korthak, weathered the psychic storms of the Mentari, and crushed the technological might of the Nexus Coalition. But they had never stolen the children of humanity. What they thought would be their greatest psychological weapon against the stubborn Terrans would become their worst nightmare. For humans, you see, possess something that the cold mathematics of galactic conquest cannot quantify: the willingness to burn down the entire universe to protect their young. When word spreads through the Terran colonies that Zephyrian raiders have taken human children for their slave markets, something awakens in humanity that has slumbered since their ancient days of tribal warfare. The Zephyrians are about to learn why humans are the only species in known space that tells bedtime stories about monsters in the dark, because they know, deep in their genetic memory, that sometimes they are the monsters. This is the story of what happens when an alien empire discovers that taking human children isn't an act of war, it's an act of extinction. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farming settlement of Haven's Rest, on the outer rim world of Kepler 442b. Sarah Chen knelt in her garden, her weathered hands gentle as she helped her 6-year-old daughter Emma plant seeds in the rich, dark soil. The colony had been peaceful for the past 3 years, ever since the Terran Federation had negotiated a non-aggression pact with the surrounding alien territories. Emma's laughter filled the air as she discovered an earthworm wriggling in the dirt. "Look, Mama, it's dancing." Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of graying hair from her face. "That's right, sweetheart. The worms help our plants grow big and strong." The tranquil morning was shattered by the screaming whine of atmospheric engines overhead. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive sound: Zephyrian attack craft. She grabbed Emma and dove behind their modest home just as the first energy bolts began raining down on the settlement. "Mama, what's happening?" Emma's voice was small and frightened, her brown eyes wide with confusion. "Stay down, baby. Stay quiet," Sarah whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She fumbled for emergency communicator, but static was all that answered her calls. The Zephyrians were jamming all frequencies. Through the chaos, Sarah could hear the methodical destruction of their peaceful community. The aliens weren't trying to level the settlement. They were herding the colonists like cattle. Energy weapons on stun settings, not kill. This wasn't a raid for resources or territory. This was something else entirely. Commander Marcus Rivera of the Colonial Defense Force had been enjoying his morning coffee in the security office when the attack began. The 43-year-old veteran of the Centauri Wars threw his mug aside and lunged for the weapons locker as the first report started flooding in over the emergency channels. "All units, this is command. We have multiple Zephyrian dropships converging on sectors 7 through 12. Repeat, this is not a drill." Marcus's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he armed himself. Plasma rifle, sidearm, tactical vest. But even as he prepared for battle, a sick feeling grew in his stomach. The attack patterns were all wrong. The Zephyrians were known for their brutal efficiency. They either conquered or destroyed. Never anything in between. This felt different. He burst through the office doors to find his Sergeant Julia Park coordinating the evacuation efforts. "Status report. Sir, they're not targeting our defenses or infrastructure. They're going straight for the residential areas. It's like they're..." Her words were cut off by an explosion that shook the building. Through the reinforced windows, they could see Zephyrian ground troops moving through the streets with purpose, but they weren't killing. They were capturing. "Dear God," Marcus breathed as the horrible realization hit him. "They're not here for the colony. They're here for the people. Doctor." Elizabeth Hawthorne was in the middle of her morning rounds at the medical center when the attack began. The 38-year-old physician had seen her share of violence during the border conflicts, but nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed that day. Through her window, she watched in horror as Zephyrian soldiers systematically moved from house to house, dragging terrified families into the streets. But it was what they did next that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The aliens were separating the children from their parents. Elizabeth's hand shook as she watched a Zephyrian warrior tear a screaming toddler from his mother's arms. The woman collapsed to her knees, begging, pleading, but the alien showed no emotion behind its chitinous face mask. Other children, some as young as 3, others barely into their teens, were being loaded onto transport platforms like cargo. "No, no, no," Elizabeth whispered, backing away from the window. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. The Zephyrians were slavers, yes, but they had never specifically targeted children. Adult slaves were more valuable, more productive. Unless they weren't taking them for labor. The thought that followed was too horrible to contemplate. But Elizabeth's medical training forced her to consider all possibilities. What did the Zephyrians want with human children? Research? Biological experiments? Or something even worse? She grabbed her emergency medical kit and began moving toward the back exit. She had to help somehow, had to save as many as she could. But as she reached the door, it burst open, and she found herself staring into the cold, reptilian eyes of a Zephyrian soldier, Dr. Fithian. Hawthorne. The alien spoke in perfectly articulated English through its translation device. You will come with us. Your medical expertise will be required. Sarah Chen clutched Emma tighter as the sounds of the attack drew closer to their hiding place. They had managed to stay hidden for nearly an hour, but she could hear the systematic searches growing nearer. Heavy footsteps, the crackle of energy weapons, and worst of all, the terrified cries of children being separated from their families. "Mama, I'm scared," Emma whispered. "I know, baby. I know." Sarah's mind raced. There had to be somewhere they could hide, somewhere the aliens wouldn't think to look. The old mining tunnels, perhaps, or the grain silos on the edge of town. But they would have to cross open ground to reach either location. A shadow fell across their hiding spot. Sarah looked up to see the distinctive silhouette of a Zephyrian soldier standing at the corner of their house. The alien's head turned slowly, scanning the area with mechanical precision. Its compound eyes reflected the morning light like polished metal. Sarah held her breath, pressing Emma's face against her chest to muffle any sound. The seconds stretched into eternity as the alien continued its search. Then, mercifully, it moved on. But their relief was short-lived. From the opposite direction came another sound, the low hum of a detection scanner. The Zephyrians weren't just searching visually. They were using technology to hunt down hidden colonists. "Mama?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Shh, baby. No matter what happens, remember that Mama loves you. Remember that Daddy loves you, even though he's far away with the fleet. Can you be brave for Mama?" Emma nodded, her small face serious beyond her years. The detection scanner's hum grew louder. Sarah closed her eyes and said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Then she heard it, the sound that would echo in her nightmares for years to come. The scanner had found them. Human offspring detected. Category 7. Initiating capture protocol. The Zephyrian soldier rounded the corner with mechanical efficiency. Up close, Sarah could see the alien's true form, roughly humanoid but taller, with elongated limbs and a chitinous exoskeleton that gleamed like polished obsidian. Its face was hidden behind a breathing apparatus, but its eyes were visible, cold, calculating, utterly without emotion. "Surrender the young one," the alien commanded in its synthetic voice. "Resistance will result in termination." Sarah stood slowly, Emma clinging to her with desperate strength. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "She's just a child. Take me instead. Take whatever you want, but please don't hurt her." The alien's head tilted slightly as if considering her words. The adult female is not required, only the offspring. "No!" Sarah backed away, clutching Emma tighter. "You can't have her. She's my daughter." "Resistance is futile," the Zephyrian stated matter-of-factly. It raised what Sarah now recognized as some kind of neural disruptor, a weapon designed to cause paralysis without permanent damage. The offspring will not be harmed if compliance is immediate. But Sarah Chen was not built for compliance when it came to her daughter's safety. Years of military training before she had become a colonist kicked in. She dove sideways, shielding Emma with her body as the energy beam scorched the air where they had been standing. "Run, Emma!" "Run to Mrs. Patterson's house and hide in the storm cellar." But Emma was too frightened to move, too young to understand the gravity of their situation. Instead, she clung to her mother with even more desperation. The Zephyrian soldier advanced with implacable calm. "Continued resistance will necessitate the use of force. The offspring's welfare is not guaranteed under hostile conditions." Sarah's mind reeled. They were trapped, outnumbered, and completely outgunned. But she would be damned if she would just hand over her daughter to these monsters without a fight. She grabbed a metal garden tool from beside their house, pathetically inadequate against an armored alien warrior, but it was all she had. "Stay back. Don't you dare touch her." The alien paused, and for a moment Sarah thought she detected something like puzzlement in its posture. It spoke into a communication device attached to its wrist. Command, this unit requires guidance. The adult human female is displaying extreme resistance patterns. Patterns. Should termination protocols be authorized? The response came back in the harsh, clicking language of the Zephyrians, but Sarah caught enough to understand the gist. The children were too valuable to risk. Subdue the adults if necessary, but the primary mission was child acquisition. Negative, soldier. Use minimal force. The offspring takes priority. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. The alien moved with frightening speed, its neural disruptor striking her center mass before she could even react. Her muscles seized, and she collapsed to the ground, paralyzed but conscious. She could only watch helplessly as the Zephyrian reached for Emma. "Mama!" Emma screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, help me!" But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but lie there as her worst nightmare unfolded before her eyes. The alien lifted Emma with clinical efficiency, ignoring the child's terrified struggles. "The offspring will be processed at Collection Point Alpha," the Zephyrian spoke into its communicator. "Adult female requires medical attention for neural disruption. Dispatch recovery team." As the alien carried Emma away, the little girl's cries echoing through the air, Sarah Chen made a promise that would soon echo across the galaxy. When she could move again, when she could speak again, she would find her daughter. And she would make these monsters pay for what they had done. She wasn't the only parent making such promises that day. By noon, the attack was over. Haven's Rest stood mostly intact, but it was a hollow victory for the colonists. The Zephyrians had taken what they came for. 137 human children between the ages of 3 and 16. They left behind parents, siblings, and extended family members, all united now by grief and a rage that transcended anything the galaxy had seen before. Commander Rivera surveyed the aftermath from the colony's communication center, his jaw set in a grim line. The Zephyrians had been ruthlessly efficient. No unnecessary casualties, minimal property damage, perfect tactical execution. It should have been a textbook example of a successful raid. But Marcus Rivera had fought aliens before, and he recognized something in this attack that chilled him to the bone. This hadn't been opportunistic slaving. This had been planned, organized, and specific. The Zephyrians had come here specifically for human children, and they had taken them with purpose. "Sir," Sergeant Park approached with a communication tablet. "We've restored long-range communications. Priority message coming in from Terran Command." Marcus took the tablet and read the message, his face growing paler with each line. When he finished, he handed it back to Park with hands that trembled slightly. "What is it, sir?" "It's not just us, Sergeant. They hit 17 colonies in the past 6 hours. Same pattern, same target demographics. The Zephyrians have taken over 2,000 human children. The weight of that number settled over the room like a death shroud. 2,000 children scattered across Zephyrian space, facing an unknown fate. "Orders, sir?" Park asked quietly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the grieving families gathering in the colony square. When he spoke, his voice carried a cold certainty that would soon be echoed by every human military officer in the galaxy. "Send a priority flash to all Terran fleets." Message reads, "The children have been taken. Operation Homecoming is authorized. All units report for duty immediately." As the message went out across the quantum communication networks, something fundamental shifted in the balance of galactic power. The Zephyrian Empire had just made the worst tactical error in its 5,000-year history. They had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping since the dark days of their early evolution. The primal, unstoppable fury of parents whose children had been stolen. The war they thought they were starting would be nothing compared to the Holocaust they had actually unleashed. For the Zephyrians had forgotten the most basic rule of survival in a universe filled with dangerous species: never threaten a human's young. The galaxy was about to learn why. Admiral Elena Vasquez received the emergency transmission while her fleet was conducting routine patrols in the Rigel sector, 18 light-years from the nearest Zephyrian border. The 62-year-old commander of the 3rd Terran Fleet had seen action in every major conflict of the past 4 decades, from the asteroid mining wars to the recent Andromedan incursion. She thought she had seen the worst that warfare could offer. She was wrong. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached her station with careful steps, his face pale beneath his regulation haircut. "Priority Alpha transmission from Terran Command." It's about the children, Admiral." Elena's blood turned to ice. She had grandchildren scattered across the frontier colonies, living on worlds that were supposed to be safe under the protection of the non-aggression treaties. Display the message, Commander. The holographic interface activated, showing the familiar seal of Terran High Command. But instead of the usual bureaucratic language of military communications, the message was brief and devastating. All fleet commanders, immediate attention. Zephyrian Empire has conducted coordinated raids on 17 frontier colonies. Primary objective, abduction of human children ages 3-16. Total taken, 2,127 confirmed. Number ransom demands received. No communication from Zephyrian authorities. All diplomatic channels severed. Operation Homecoming authorized. Bring them home, by any means necessary. The bridge fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Elena read the message twice, her military training warring with her maternal instincts. 2,100 children. Taken by an empire that was known for its casual cruelty and complete disregard for alien life. Ma'am? Commander Hayes's voice was carefully controlled. Orders? Elena looked around the bridge at the faces of her crew. These weren't just soldiers. They were parents, siblings, aunts and uncles. Many of them had family on the frontier worlds. She could see the same cold fury building in their eyes that was burning in her own chest. Signal all ships in the fleet, she said quietly. Emergency recall. All shore leaves cancelled, all non-essential operations suspended. I want us combat ready within the hour. Destination, Admiral? Elena's smile held no warmth. Zephyrian Space, Commander. We're going to have a conversation with the Empire about the return of stolen property. Halfway across the galaxy, Captain Sarah Chen's husband, Lieutenant Colonel David Chen of the Terran Marine Corps, was leading a training exercise on the military world of Sparta Prime when the news reached him. The career soldier had been through hell and back during the Centauri Wars, had seen his share of atrocities and injustices, but nothing had prepared him for the message that arrived via encrypted military channels. His wife was in medical treatment for neural disruption injuries. His daughter Emma was missing, taken by Zephyrian raiders along with hundreds of other children. The colony of Haven's Rest was requesting immediate military assistance. David read the message 3 times before the reality sank in. Then he did something that would become legendary among the Marines who served under him. He walked calmly to the exercise observation post, picked up a 100-kilogram concrete barrier with his bare hands, and hurled it 50 meters across the training ground. Sir? Sergeant Major Rodriguez approached cautiously. In all his years serving under Colonel Chen, he had never seen his commanding officer display such raw emotion. Sergeant Major David's voice was deadly calm. Signal all Marine units. Training exercises terminated. We have new orders. What's the mission, sir? David looked up at the afternoon sky of Sparta Prime, where he could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening atmosphere. Somewhere out there, his little girl was frightened and alone, in the hands of monsters who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. We're going to war, Sergeant Major, and we're not coming back without our children. The response across human space was immediate and total. Military units abandoned their posts and headed for the nearest deployment centers. Retired veterans emerged from civilian life to offer their services. Scientists abandoned their research to work on weapons development. Industrial facilities shifted from consumer goods to military production. But it wasn't just the military response that would define humanity's reaction. It was what happened in the civilian sectors that truly demonstrated the depths of human fury when their young were threatened. Dr. Marcus Webb, a civilian xenobiologist working on the research station Kepler, Tree, received the news while analyzing genetic samples from a newly discovered species. The mild-mannered scientist who had dedicated his life to peaceful interspecies cooperation calmly set down his instruments and walked to the station's communications center. I need to send a message to Terran Science Command, he told the communications officer. Of course, Doctor. What's the priority level? Maximum. Tell them that the Zephyrian Biological Research Project has new parameters. The young officer looked puzzled. I wasn't aware we had any joint projects with the Zephyrians, sir. Doctor? Webb's smile was colder than the vacuum of space. We do now. I'm going to teach them what happens to their physiology when exposed to custom-designed biological agents. Consider it a learning experience. Similar conversations were happening across human space. Engineers began designing new weapon systems. Psychologists started developing interrogation techniques specifically tailored to Zephyrian mental structures. Even artists and entertainers joined the war effort, creating propaganda that would steal human resolve and demoralize their enemies. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. the civilian shipping corporations. Jessica Morrison ran Morrison Interstellar Transport, a mid-sized cargo company that specialized in frontier deliveries. She was reviewing shipping manifests in her office on New Geneva when her assistant burst through the door with tears streaming down her face. "Ms. Morrison, I just got word from my sister on Kepler 442b. The Zephyrians, they took her daughter. They took little Amy. Jessica had known Amy since the girl was born. She was one of those children who called every adult in her life aunt or uncle, and her bright smile was one of the highlights of Jessica's quarterly supply runs to Haven's Rest. How many ships do we have available for immediate deployment?" Jessica asked quietly. 37, ma'am. But the Terran military has already put out a request for all available transport vessels. Cancel all commercial contracts. Every ship, every crew member who's willing to volunteer. We're not hauling cargo anymore. What are we hauling? Jessica's expression was grim. Marines, medical supplies, and anything else the military needs to bring our children home. The transformation of human civilization happened with breathtaking speed. Within 72 hours of the initial raids, the entire Terran Federation had shifted to a war footing that made their previous conflicts look like minor skirmishes. But this mobilization was different from anything in human history. It wasn't driven by politics or economics or territorial disputes. It was driven by the most primal force in human nature, the protection of their young. Admiral Chen Yuki, commander of the Terran First Fleet and the highest-ranking military officer in human space, stood in the war room of Terran Command on Earth, looking at the holographic display that showed the disposition of Zephyrian forces. The 70-year-old admiral had spent her entire career preparing for the possibility of large-scale interstellar warfare, but she had never imagined it would begin like this. "Status report," she ordered, as her staff assembled around the tactical table. General Harrison, head of Marine Operations, spoke first. "All Marine divisions are deploying to forward staging areas. We've got volunteer rates of 112%. 112%?
Admiral Chen raised an eyebrow. "Yes, ma'am."
"We're getting volunteers from civilian sectors, including individuals with no military training, who are demanding to be allowed to participate in rescue operations." Admiral Chen nodded grimly. She understood the sentiment. If her own grandchildren were among the missing, she would gladly throw aside 4 decades of military protocol to get them back. "Intelligence update," she continued. Colonel Martinez from Intelligence stepped forward. "We've identified the likely destination for the captured children. Zephyrian intelligence has been intercepted, discussing something called Project Synthesis. We believe they're being held on 3 heavily fortified worlds in the Zephyrian core systems." "What's Project Synthesis?" "Unknown, ma'am. But based on the pattern of abductions and the age demographics, we believe it's some kind of biological research program." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Admiral Chen had seen intelligence reports about Zephyrian research methods. The species had no moral constraints when it came to experimentation, particularly on beings they considered inferior. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Unknown, ma'am, but based on previous Zephyrian research programs, probably not long." Admiral Chen looked around the room at the faces of her senior staff. These were career military officers, trained to think strategically rather than emotionally, but every one of them understood what was at stake. "Recommendations? Full-scale invasion," General Harrison said immediately. "Hit them fast, hit them hard, don't give them time to dispose of evidence." "That would mean war with the entire Zephyrian Empire," Admiral Chen pointed out. "They have almost twice our fleet strength and control 37 star systems." "With respect, Admiral," Colonel Martinez spoke up, "I don't think we have a choice. They've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. If we don't respond decisively, every other predatory species in the galaxy will see this as a sign of weakness." Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. A war with the Zephyrian Empire would be devastating. Millions of human and alien lives would be lost. Entire worlds might be destroyed. The carefully built peace that had existed for the past decade would shatter. But somewhere in Zephyrian space, over 2,000 human children were facing an unimaginable fate. "Signal all fleet commanders," she said finally. "Operation Homecoming is now our primary strategic objective. I want detailed attack plans for all 3 target worlds within 18 hours. "Ma'am," General Harrison asked quietly, "rules of engagement?" Admiral Chen looked up at the holographic display, where the red dots marking Zephyrian positions seemed to pulse like drops of blood against the starfield. "Total war, General. No quarter asked, none given. We get our children back. or we burn their empire to ash. The orders went out across human space with the speed of quantum communication. Every warship, every marine unit, every support vessel began converging on the Zephyrian border. It was the largest military mobilization in human history, but it was more than that. It was a species declaring war not for conquest or politics, but for the most fundamental right that any parent could claim, the safety of their children. The Zephyrian Empire was about to learn something that every predator species eventually discovered. Humans would tolerate almost any provocation, endure almost any insult, accept almost any injustice, but take their children and they would show you why they were the apex predators of an entire world. The war that followed would reshape the galaxy. Supreme Commander Zethkar of the Zephyrian Empire stood in his command chamber aboard the flagship Inevitable Conquest, reviewing the reports from the human frontier raids with satisfaction. The operation had been executed flawlessly. 17 colonies hit simultaneously. Over 2,000 young humans captured with minimal casualties to his forces. The humans had been caught completely off guard. Their primitive defensive systems no match for Zephyrian military precision. The tall reptilian commander allowed himself a moment of pride as he examined the tactical displays. Project Synthesis could now proceed to the next phase, and the Empire would soon possess capabilities that would make them the undisputed rulers of this spiral arm of the galaxy. The humans, despite their annoying tendency toward violence and unpredictability, had provided exactly what his scientists needed. Excellency, his aide Subcommander Vexthal approached with a data tablet. Initial reports from the research facilities. The human offspring are responding well to the preliminary preparations. Excellent. How long before Dr. Kentor can begin the primary experiments? 12 standard cycles, Excellency. The subjects need time to adapt to our atmospheric conditions and nutritional supplements. Zethkar nodded approvingly. The humans were remarkably adaptable for such a primitive species, far more so than the Andromedan subjects they had used in previous experiments. Their children would make ideal test subjects for the consciousness transfer protocols. What of the human military response? He asked casually. Vexthal's expression flickered with what might have been concern in a lesser species. Increased chatter on their communication networks, some mobilization of their frontier fleets. Nothing beyond expected parameters. Good. Maintain surveillance, but don't interfere. Let them posture and make threats. When they realize the futility of opposing the Empire, they'll accept the loss and move on. Humans are emotional creatures, but they're also practical. What Supreme Commander Zethkar didn't know was that his intelligence network had catastrophically underestimated the human response. The increased chatter was actually the complete mobilization of human civilization. The Sum mobilization was the largest war fleet in human history, currently burning through space towards Zephyrian territory at maximum velocity. And the humans were anything but practical when their children's lives were at stake. Dr. Krantor supervised the preparation of Laboratory Complex 7 with the detached professionalism that had made her the Empire's leading expert on xenobiological research. The spider-like Zephyrian scientist had conducted consciousness transfer experiments on 17 different species over the past decade, perfecting the techniques that would allow Zephyrian elite to achieve functional immortality by transferring their minds into younger, healthier bodies. The process required subjects with developing neural pathways, essentially children, and the human specimens promised to be the most compatible they had yet discovered. Unlike previous subjects, the human children showed remarkable resilience to the preliminary neural mapping procedures. Status report on subjects 1847 through 1893, she commanded one of her assistants. All subjects remain viable, Doctor. Neural activity is within acceptable parameters for consciousness mapping. The youngest subjects show the greatest plasticity. As expected, Dr. Krantor moved through the laboratory, observing the rows of containment pods where human children floated in nutrient solution, their minds connected to the Empire's most advanced neural interface technology. The subjects ranged in age from 3 to 16, carefully selected for optimal brain development characteristics. She paused at subject 1851, a small female with brown hair who had shown particularly strong resistance to the neural sedatives. The child's file indicated her designation was Emma Chen, though such primitive naming conventions were irrelevant to the research. This subject continues to show anomalous brain activity during the mapping process. She noted to her assistant, "Increase the sedation protocols. Doctor, we've already exceeded recommended dosages for a subject this size. Further increases could result in permanent neural damage. Acceptable losses." "Doctor, how?" Krantor replied coldly. "The consciousness transfer process will overwrite the original neural patterns anyway. Subject viability is only required for the initial mapping phase. What the Zephyrian scientists didn't understand was that human children possessed something that no other species in the galaxy had developed, an almost supernatural resilience to psychological trauma. Emma Chen, despite the drugs and neural interfaces, remained aware of her surroundings and was quietly communicating with the other children through a system of taps and movement that the aliens hadn't recognized as language. She was also remembering everything, storing away details about the facility, the guards, and the researchers that would prove invaluable when the rescue came. Because unlike the Zephyrians, Emma had never doubted that someone was coming for them. Her daddy was a soldier, her mama was strong, and humans never abandon their children. It was one of the first lessons she had learned, and it gave her the courage to endure whatever these monsters did to her. 3 sectors away, the first Terran fleet elements were already engaging Zephyrian border patrols. Admiral Vasquez had divided her forces into 3 attack groups, each targeting one of the suspected research facilities. The fighting had begun with devastating effectiveness. The Zephyrians had always prided themselves on their military superiority, built on technological advancement and tactical precision. They fought with calculated efficiency, using minimum force to achieve maximum strategic effect. It was a doctrine that had served them well for millennia, but they had never faced humans fighting for their children. The Terran attack groups came in like nothing the Zephyrians had ever encountered. Human warships pushed their engines past safe operating limits, closing to ranges that should have been suicidal. Human Marines launched boarding operations against impossible odds. Human pilots flew attack runs that violated every principle of self-preservation. And they won. Captain Jennifer Walsh commanded the Terran destroyer Righteous Fury as it closed with a Zephyrian heavy cruiser that outmassed her ship by a factor of 3. Under normal circumstances, the engagement would have been a death sentence for her crew, but these weren't normal circumstances. "Range to target?" she called out. 8,000 kilometers and closing, Captain. They're signaling us to withdraw or be destroyed. Signal back our response, Captain Walsh ordered. Tell them we've come for our children, and we're not leaving without them. The Zephyrian cruiser opened fire with its primary plasma batteries, energy beams designed to disable enemy engines and weapons systems while leaving the crew alive for interrogation. It was standard Imperial doctrine, capture when possible, destroy only when necessary. But Captain Walsh didn't order evasive maneuvers. Instead, she pushed her engines to full emergency power and drove straight at the enemy ship. "Ma'am, they're targeting our engine section," her tactical officer reported. "Let them. All power to forward shields and weapons. I want every gun we have locked on their bridge section." The Righteous Fury absorbed hit after hit from the Zephyrian vessel, her shields failing and armor plating melting under the assault. But she kept coming, kept closing the distance while her own weapons hammered at the enemy ship's command structure. "Captain, we're losing hull integrity on decks 7 through 12. Maintain course and speed." The 2 ships closed to point-blank range, trading devastating fire. The Zephyrian captain trained in conventional tactics tried to break off and gain maneuvering room, but Captain Walsh anticipated the move and matched it, keeping her guns trained on the enemy's most vulnerable systems. "Direct hit on their command bridge, Captain. They're listing to starboard. Follow them." "I want that ship disabled, not destroyed. There might be intelligence about our children aboard." The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, the Zephyrian heavy cruiser was a drifting wreck, its crew either dead or unconscious from oxygen loss. The Righteous Fury was barely spaceworthy, but she had accomplished her mission. Similar battles were erupting throughout the border systems as human forces carved a path toward the suspected research facilities. The Zephyrians, caught off guard by the ferocity and apparent disregard for losses shown by the humans, began falling back to more defensible positions. But retreat only delayed the inevitable. Supreme Commander Zethkar reviewed the tactical reports with growing concern. His forces were reporting human battle groups operating with a level of aggression that bordered on madness. Human ships were ramming Zephyrian vessels rather than accepting defeat. Human Marines were fighting to the last soldier rather than surrendering when overwhelmed. Human commanders were accepting casualty rates that should have caused any rational species to withdraw. "Excellency," Vexthal approached with obvious distress. "Forward Command reports that the humans have broken through our defensive perimeter in Sector 7. They're heading directly for Research Facility Alpha."
"How is that possible?"
"That facility is protected by the 7th Fleet. The 7th Fleet no longer exists, Excellency. The humans destroyed it." Zethkar stared at his aide in disbelief. The 7th Fleet consisted of 43 warships, including 2 dreadnoughts. For a human force to destroy it entirely would require overwhelming numerical superiority. How many ships did the humans lose? Intelligence estimates: 12 destroyed, perhaps 20 damaged. That was impossible. No species could accept those kinds of losses and continue fighting effectively. The survivors should have withdrawn to regroup and plan a more careful assault. Unless... Subcommander, show me the tactical analysis of human communication intercepts. Vexthal activated the holographic display, showing the translation matrices for captured human transmissions. As Zethkar read through the intercepts, a cold realization began to settle over him. The humans weren't fighting a conventional military campaign. They weren't trying to capture territory or destroy strategic targets. They were fighting a rescue operation, and they viewed any cost as acceptable if it meant reaching their captured children. How long before they reached the research facilities? He asked quietly. At current rates of advance, perhaps 18 standard cycles. Zethkar turned to look out at the starfield visible through his command chamber's observation port. Somewhere out there, the most dangerous predatory species he had ever encountered was bearing down on his empire's most valuable research installations. And they weren't coming to negotiate. Signal Dr. Krentor immediately. Tell her to accelerate the experimental timeline. If the humans reach those facilities before we've extracted the necessary data... He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what would happen if the humans reached their children before Project Synthesis was complete. The facilities would be destroyed, the research lost, and the Empire would face a war with an enemy that seemed immune to conventional deterrence. For the first time in his long military career, Supreme Commander Zethkar began to wonder if the Zephyrian Empire had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They had taken the young of a species that valued their offspring above their own lives, and now that species was coming for them with the fury of avenging angels. The hunter had become the hunted. Dr. Krantor worked with desperate efficiency as alarms wailed throughout Research Facility Alpha. The human fleet had broken through the outer defense perimeter faster than anyone had thought possible, and intelligence reports indicated they would reach the facility within hours rather than days. The consciousness transfer experiment that was supposed to take 12 cycles now had to be completed in 3. Accelerate the neural mapping on all subjects, she ordered her research team. I want preliminary consciousness templates extracted from at least 50 subjects before the facility comes under direct attack. Doctor, the accelerated process will likely cause permanent brain damage to the subjects, her chief assistant protested. The neural pathways aren't sufficiently developed for rapid extraction. The subjects are irrelevant once we have the templates. Doctor, Krentor snapped. Begin immediately with the youngest subjects. Their neural plasticity is highest. In Containment Pod 1851, 6-year-old Emma Chen felt the machines connected to her head begin to hum with increased energy. The sedatives in her system weren't enough to completely suppress her awareness, and she understood with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in mortal danger that the monsters were about to do something much worse to her and her friends. But Emma also heard something the aliens couldn't. The faint vibration through the facility structure that meant big ships were getting closer. Ships with human engines, human weapons, and most importantly, human parents who were coming to take their children home. She began the tapping sequence she had taught the other children, the code that meant, "Daddy's coming, be ready." The message passed from pod to pod through the laboratory complex as dozens of human children prepared themselves for rescue. What none of them knew was that the rescue force approaching their location was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Chen Yuki stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship Indomitable, watching the tactical display as her combined fleet approached Research Facility Alpha. 347 ships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to tiny corvettes crewed by civilian volunteers. It was the largest single-fleet action in human history, but Chen knew the odds were still against them. The Zephyrians had used the time during the human advance to reinforce their research facilities with everything they had: orbital defense platforms, minefields, automated weapon satellites, and a Guardian fleet of over 200 warships surrounded each facility. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a position would require months of preparation and siege warfare. They had hours, perhaps less, before the experiments on the children reached a point of no return. Signal from Admiral Santos aboard the Vengeful Mother, her communications officer reported. The second attack group is in position around Research Facility Beta. And Admiral Rodriguez? Third attack group reports ready at Research Facility Gamma, ma'am. Admiral Chen nodded. The plan was simple in concept, horrifyingly complex in execution. 3 simultaneous assaults on the most heavily defended positions in Zephyrian space with the goal of rescuing over 2,000 children before their captors could complete whatever monstrous experiments they had planned. "Signal all ships," she commanded. "Operation Homecoming enters final phase in 60 seconds. Remember, people, we're not here to win a war. We're here to bring our children home." The response that came back over the communication channels was unlike anything in military history. Instead of the crisp "acknowledged" of professional soldiers, Admiral Chen heard voices thick with emotion, determination that transcended mere duty. "For Emma Chen and all the others. For my grandson Tommy. For every child who needs us. Bring them home." The assault began with a coordinated bombardment that lit up the darkness of space like a newborn star. Every human ship opened fire simultaneously, pouring an unimaginable amount of destructive energy at the Zephyrian defenses. But this wasn't the measured, tactical engagement that military doctrine called for. This was the fury of an entire species focused on a single objective. Captain David Chen led the Marine assault on Research Facility Alpha from the boarding pod of the transport ship Protective Fury. The career soldier had volunteered to spearhead the boarding action not because of his tactical expertise, but because his daughter Emma was somewhere in that facility, and he would be damned if he let anyone else reach her first. 2 minutes to contact, the pilot announced over the communication system. Zephyrian defensive fire is intense. Through the pod's viewports, David could see the space around the research facility filled with energy beams, missile trails, and the brief flares of ships dying. The human fleet was paying a terrible price for each kilometer they advanced, but they were advancing. "Listen up, Marines," David spoke to his assault team over the internal communications. "Intelligence says the children are being held in laboratory complex, 7-12 levels down from the main docking bay. We going fast, we going hard, and we don't stop until every child is accounted for." "What about resistance, Colonel?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. David's smile held no humor. "Zephyrian troops are trained to fight soldiers, Sergeant. They're not prepared to face parents." The boarding pod slammed into the facility's docking bay with bone-jarring force, its cutting charges blowing through the armored hull like it was paper. David was the first man through the breach, his assault rifle spitting plasma fire at anything that moved. The Zephyrian defenders had prepared for a military assault. Barricades, crossfire zones, automated defenses. What they hadn't prepared for was the sheer ferocity of humans fighting for their children. David's Marines advanced through defensive positions that should have taken hours to clear, simply overwhelming the defenders through speed and absolute disregard for their own safety. "Colonel, we've got wounded," Corporal Martinez reported as they fought their way through the facility's corridors. "How bad?" Henderson took a plasma burst to the chest. "He's down." David looked back at the fallen Marine, then at the route ahead that led to the laboratory complex. In any normal military operation, he would have detailed soldiers to evacuate the wounded, but this wasn't a normal operation. "Henderson, can you hold this position?" The wounded Marine looked up with pain-glazed eyes but managed to grin. "Sir, my little nephew is in this facility. I can hold until you get back with the kids." That was the moment David Chen realized they weren't just going to rescue the children. They were going to succeed, because failure literally wasn't an option for any human in this operation. Dr. Contour watched the facility's defensive status displays with growing panic. The humans had broken through 3 defensive perimeters in less than an hour and were now fighting their way through the facility's internal structure. Her research complex was 12 levels down, protected by automated systems and a garrison of 50 elite Zephyrian guards. It should have been impregnable. "Doctor, the neural extraction process is only 30% complete," her assistant reported. "At current rates, we need at least 4 more hours. How long before the humans reach this level?" "Security estimates perhaps 40 minutes, assuming they can penetrate the automated defenses." "Doctor." Krentor looked at the rows of containment pods holding human children. 30% completion meant she had consciousness templates from only about 30 subjects, nowhere near enough for the complete research program. But it might be enough to preserve the most critical data. Begin emergency data backup procedures. If we can't complete the extraction, at least we can preserve what we've learned. But as she spoke, the facility shuddered from a massive explosion somewhere in the upper levels. The human advance was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Emma Chen felt the vibrations growing stronger as the fighting drew closer to their location. The neural extraction machines were working frantically, sending jolts of pain through her small body as they tried to map her developing brain. But Emma held on to one thought that gave her strength. Her daddy was a Marine, and Marines never gave up. She could hear other children crying in the pods around her, some calling for their parents, others just whimpering in fear and pain. Emma wanted to comfort them, but the machines made it hard to move or speak. Then she heard it. The distinct sound of human weapons fire coming from the levels above them. The rescue had arrived. Colonel David Chen and his Marines fought their way through Laboratory Complex 7 with methodical fury. The Zephyrian guards were well-trained and well-equipped, but they were fighting an enemy that cared more about reaching their objective than surviving the battle. "Plasma charges on the main laboratory doors," David ordered as his team reached the final barrier. "Sir, there might be children on the other side," Sergeant Rodriguez warned. "Then we better make sure our aim is perfect," David replied grimly. The charges blew the doors inward, and David led his team into a chamber that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Rows upon rows of containment pods filled the vast space, each one holding a human child connected to alien machinery by neural interface cables. Some of the children were unconscious, others were clearly in pain, and a few were, "Jesus Christ," one of his Marines whispered. "Stay focused," David commanded, though his own voice was shaking. "We're here to get them out." He moved through the laboratory, checking each pod for signs of life. Most of the children were still viable, though clearly traumatized by their ordeal. But some of the pods were dark, their occupants having succumbed to the brutal experimental procedures. David found Emma in pod 1851, and for a moment his military training completely deserted him. His little girl was floating in alien nutrient fluid, her head covered with neural interface cables, her small body bearing the marks of invasive procedures.
Daddy?
Her voice was weak, transmitted through the pod's communication system, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard.
I'm here, sweetheart.
"Daddy's here. We're going to get you out." But as David worked to free his daughter from the containment pod, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. "Doctor?" Krentor had activated the laboratory's self-destruct system rather than allow her research to fall into human hands. The rescue force had minutes to evacuate over 100 children from a facility that was about to become a thermonuclear fireball. "All teams, emergency evacuation protocols," David broadcast over the communications network. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before this whole place goes up." The next few minutes would test every aspect of human courage, ingenuity, and devotion to their young. Marines who had never worked with children found themselves carefully removing traumatized kids from alien machinery. Medics performed emergency treatment on subjects who had been unconscious for days. Engineers jury-rigged portable life support systems for children whose bodies had been too damaged to survive without artificial assistance. And through it all, David Chen carried his daughter Emma in his arms, whispering words of comfort and love as they fought their way back through the exploding facility to the evacuation ships. They made it out with 17 seconds to spare. As Research Facility Alpha erupted in a ball of fire behind them, David looked down at his daughter's face and made a promise that echoed the thoughts of every human parent in the rescue fleet. This would never happen again. Humanity would make sure of it. The galaxy was about to learn that there were some lines that should never be crossed, and threatening human children was the most absolute of those lines. The Zephyrian Empire had awakened something in humanity that would reshape the balance of power throughout this arm of the galaxy. And they were going to pay for it. Supreme Commander Zefkar stood in the ruins of his command center aboard the inevitable Conquest, staring at the tactical displays that told the story of the greatest military disaster in Zephyrian history. All 3 research facilities had fallen to the human assault. The Guardian fleets had been shattered. And somewhere in the wreckage of a 5,000-year-old empire, over 2,000 human children were being evacuated to safety by their rescuers. But the humans weren't done. "Status report," he commanded, his voice hollow with defeat. Sub-Commander Vexthal approached with obvious reluctance. "Research Facility Alpha destroyed. Guardian Fleet 7, 9 to 3% casualties. Research Facility Beta captured intact. Guardian Fleet 12, complete destruction. Research Facility Gamma evacuated, then destroyed by human nuclear weapons. And, Dr. Krentor's research? The consciousness transfer project has been completely compromised. All data cores were either destroyed or captured by human forces. The experiments cannot be continued." Zethkar closed his eyes. Project Synthesis had been the Empire's greatest hope for technological advancement, the key to immortality, for the ruling class and absolute dominance over the lesser species of the galaxy. 20 years of research, countless resources, and the sacrifice of hundreds of test subjects from dozens of species, all lost because they had underestimated the human response to a simple slaving operation. "Sir," Vexthal continued quietly, We're receiving communications from the human fleet commanders. They're demanding unconditional surrender of all forces involved in the child abduction operations. And if we refuse? They've stated they will consider the entire Zephyrian Empire a legitimate military target until every individual responsible for harming their children has been delivered for justice. Zefkar understood the implications. The humans had demonstrated their willingness to accept catastrophic losses to achieve their objectives. If they decided that the entire empire was their enemy, they would fight until either humanity or the Zephyrians were extinct. What are their specific demands? Vexthal consulted his data tablet. Complete surrender of all military personnel involved in Operation Harvest. Full medical records for all captured children. Reparations to the families affected. And, he paused, clearly disturbed by what he was reading. Continue. They demand the extradition of all research personnel involved in Project Synthesis for trial under human law. The silence in the command center was absolute. In 5,000 years of Zephyrian expansion, no alien species had ever demanded the extradition of Imperial citizens for trial under foreign law. It was unthinkable, a complete violation of Imperial sovereignty. It was also completely non-negotiable from the human perspective. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the Zephyrian command ship drift powerless in space after its final defensive systems had been systematically destroyed. Around her, the combined human fleet maintained a formation that spoke of barely controlled violence, every weapon trained on potential targets, every ship ready to resume the attack at a moment's notice. Admiral, her communications officer reported, we're receiving a transmission from the Zephyrian commander. He's requesting terms for a ceasefire. Put him through. The holographic display activated, showing the reptilian features of Supreme Commander Zefkar. The alien leader looked exhausted, defeated, but Elena could still see defiance in his alien eyes. Admiral Vasquez, I am prepared to discuss the return of your captured personnel in exchange for the cessation of hostilities against Imperial forces. Elena's expression didn't change. Commander, you seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. This isn't a negotiation. You stole our children, subjected them to medical experiments, and caused them unimaginable trauma. We're not here to make deals. Then what are your terms? Complete and unconditional surrender of every individual involved in the abduction and mistreatment of human children. Full access to all research data related to the experiments. Reparations to be determined by the families of the victims. And the immediate extradition of all research personnel for trial. Zefkar's composure finally cracked. Those terms are impossible. You're demanding the dissolution of Imperial authority.
I'm demanding justice, Elena replied coldly.
Your choice is simple. Comply with our demands or watch your empire burn. You cannot be serious. The Zephyrian Empire controls 37 star systems. We have allies throughout this sector. A war between our species would devastate the entire region. Admiral Vasquez leaned forward, and for the first time, Zefkar saw something in her eyes that made him understand why the humans had fought with such terrifying effectiveness. Commander, do you have children? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Yes. 3 offspring. Then imagine how you would feel if aliens came to your world, stole your children, and subjected them to painful medical experiments. Imagine the rage you would feel, the lengths you would go to get them back. Zefkar said nothing. Now multiply that by 2,000 families, and you'll begin to understand what you're facing. This isn't about politics or territory or resources. You took our children, and we will go to war with the entire galaxy if necessary to ensure it never happens again. The transmission ended, leaving Zefkar alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that the Zephyrian Empire had committed the greatest strategic blunder in its history. Colonel David Chen sat in the medical bay aboard the rescue ship Mercy's Grace, holding his daughter Emma as human doctors worked to undo the damage caused by the Zephyrian experiments. The little girl was physically unharmed but psychologically traumatized, alternating between clinging to her father and staring blankly at nothing. "How is she, Doc?" David asked Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief medical officer. "Physically, she'll be fine. The neural interfaces didn't cause any permanent damage. Psychologically, that's going to take time." What these children experienced, she shook her head. "We're going to need the best child psychologists in human space to help them recover." David looked down at Emma, who was finally sleeping peacefully for the first time since the rescue. "What about the others? We saved 2,127 children from the 3 facilities. We lost." Dr. Williams's voice caught. "We lost 38. The experiments had progressed too far for them to survive removal from the alien machinery." David felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. 38 families would be going home without their children. 38 young lives cut short by alien monsters who saw human children as nothing more than experimental subjects. Duck, I need you to document everything. Every injury, every procedure, every indication of what was done to these kids. I want a complete medical record. Of course, but why? Because when the trials start, I want to make sure the people responsible for this pay for every single thing they did. The trials David referred to would become known throughout human space as the Children's Justice Tribunals. Unlike previous interspecies conflicts that ended with territorial adjustments and reparations, humanity demanded something unprecedented: the application of human law to alien war criminals. The Zephyrian Empire, faced with the choice between total war and surrendering the individuals responsible for Project Synthesis, chose surrender. Over the following months, 347 Zephyrian military officers, scientists, and government officials were extradited to human space for trial. The proceedings were broadcast across the galaxy, and for the first time, alien species witnessed human justice applied to those who had harmed human children. The trials were scrupulously fair, with full legal representation for the defendants and strict adherence to due process. The sentences were not. Dr. Cantor, the lead scientist for Project Synthesis, was sentenced to life imprisonment on the prison world of Tartarus Prime, where she would spend the rest of her extended lifespan in a cell designed to accommodate her specific biological needs, while ensuring she never harmed another child. Supreme Commander Zefkar was found guilty of crimes against children and sentenced to death, a sentence that was commuted to life imprisonment only because several of the human parents testified that they wanted him to live with the knowledge of what he had done. But the most significant outcome of the trials wasn't the sentences themselves. It was the message they sent to every species in the galaxy. Humanity would no longer tolerate attacks on their children, and they had the military might to enforce that declaration. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of Haven's Rest as the colony slowly rebuilt itself in the months following the rescue. The buildings had been repaired, the defensive systems upgraded, and life had returned to something approaching normalcy. But the scars remained, both visible and invisible. Emma was in therapy, learning to cope with the nightmares and flashbacks that came from her ordeal. Some days were better than others, but she was slowly healing. All of the rescued children were, with the help of the best medical and psychological care humanity could provide. Mama? Emma approached from where she had been playing with her dolls. A carefully supervised activity designed to help her process her experiences. What is it, sweetheart? Will the bad aliens ever come back? Sarah knelt down and hugged her daughter, looking out at the stars visible through the observation dome. Somewhere out there, human warships patrolled the borders of known space with new orders. Any species that threatened human children would face the full wrath of the Terran Federation. No, baby, they won't come back. Daddy and all the other soldiers made sure of that. Good, Emma said simply, then returned to her dolls. But Sarah continued to look at the stars, thinking about the changes that had swept through human civilization in the wake of the Children's War. As historians had begun calling it, humanity had discovered something about itself during those terrible weeks, that they were capable of a level of focused violence that frightened even themselves when their children were threatened. The galaxy had taken note. 3 months after the trials concluded, representatives from 17 different alien species requested formal non-aggression pacts with the Terran Federation, specifically including clauses that prohibited any actions against human children. 6 species that had previously been hostile to human expansion suddenly became cooperative neighbors. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer seen as a relatively harmless frontier species. They were now recognized as the galaxy's apex predators, and their young were absolutely off-limits. Admiral Chen Yuki reviewed the final reports from Operation Homecoming in her office on Earth, surrounded by commendations, casualty lists, and strategic assessments. The human fleet had lost 43 ships and over 8,000 personnel in the rescue operation. Under normal military criteria, it would have been classified as a Pyrrhic victory at best. But every military commander in human space knew the truth. It had been the most important victory in their species' history. Admiral, her aide entered with a communication tablet. Priority message from Frontier Command. The Andromedan Confederation is requesting a meeting to discuss renewed trade agreements. Chen smiled grimly. The Andromedans had been hostile to human expansion for decades, using every diplomatic and economic tool at their disposal to limit Terran influence. Now they wanted to talk. Schedule the meeting. I suspect they'll be very reasonable in their proposals. The aide nodded and left, leaving Chen alone with her thoughts. The Children's War had cost humanity dearly in blood and resources, that it had also established them as a power that no one in the galaxy wanted to cross. More importantly, it had sent a message that would echo through the centuries. Human children were under the protection of the most dangerous species in known space, and anyone who threatened them would face consequences beyond imagination. Emma Chen, now 8 years old and largely recovered from her ordeal, often looked up at the stars from her family's new home on New Geneva, where her father had been reassigned to train the next generation of colonial Marines. She didn't remember all the details of her time in the alien facility. The therapist said that was normal, a way for her mind to protect itself. But she remembered the most important part, when she needed them most. Her parents and thousands of other humans had crossed the galaxy to bring her home. It was a lesson she would never forget, and one she would pass on to her own children decades later. No matter how far apart they might be, no matter what dangers they faced, humans never abandoned their young. It was a promise, written in starlight and sealed with the blood of those who would die before breaking it. The galaxy had learned to respect that promise. And in the years that followed, no alien species would ever again make the mistake of threatening a human child. The Children's War was over, but its legacy would endure for millennia. A reminder that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their military might, but their willingness to sacrifice everything to protect their young. In the end, that had made all the difference.